Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nagella.
And I'm Catherine Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mindset. Our hosts are back yet again. It's Catherine and Michelle. We are so excited to have a wonderful guest with us today, Alissa Nolden. Alissa, would you mind sharing a little bit about who you are and give us just an intro about what makes you so cool?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. As Catherine mentioned, Alissa Nolden. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts in the food science department, and I am a sensory scientist. Today we'll be talking about plant-based meats, maybe most of it, and I also do other research in the area of taste loss and cancer survivors. So very polarizing to what we'll be talking about today, but I do have a wide variety of topics that I'm interested in.
Very cool. So I know I've known you for a bit of time now, but give us all a little bit of backstory. So how did you go from being a regular person to being a sensory superstar? Like, what got you into sensory science?
That's a really good question. And it's, coming up here at UMass we're starting another year for undergrads in our department. So I actually did my undergrad at UMass Amherst in food science. And when I started, maybe I was interested in nutrition. I was like, oh, I'll be creating products. And I was luckily able to have a internship at Kraft Foods, which is now Mondelez. And it wasn't until that experience that I actually was exposed to sensory. And my experience is a little bit different.
Yeah, because nobody actually knows that whole process exists, right? Mm-hmm. They think maybe there's some chefs that create things. But I think I talk to people all the time when they ask me what I do, and they're like, oh, that's a thing.
I am curious, when you were deciding to get into food science off this recording, you mentioned that you scooped some ice cream in high school. Did that have any influence on what you inevitably ended up majoring in?
I haven't thought about it that much, whether or not that experience of working in an ice cream shop, which I really did enjoy. I really liked chemistry and making food. Mm-hmm. And so that led me to first looking into schools that had nutrition. Mm-hmm. And while I was interviewing at different schools, someone was like, you should really check out food science. And granted, that school had a very small food science program. I did end up going to UMass, which is a moderately sized food science department, but they didn't have a sensory scientist, and their exposure of sensory is pretty minimal. And so it wasn't until the internship that I was exposed to a couple, at least one actually central location test, and actually led me to think like, is this really what we should be doing when we so it kind of had the opposite effect on me of like, I found it very fascinating, but it caused me to pause and question, are these the right approaches and methods that we should be engaging with consumers to learn about whether or not we launch a food product? So that kind of is what sparked me to look into.
Oh, interesting. So what techniques do you mean? Not to call Mondelez out on what they're doing.
It not necessarily with the technique, but say for in between junior and senior year, a female, and I'm being brought to a mall, and this guy on a clipboard is going up to random people in a mall and asking them to participate in a study. Mm-hmm. And I just put myself in their shoes of, if I was in this mall by myself, would I be willing to participate in this test? And then being brought down this long, narrow hallway away from everything else in this mall.
With some random
I just
person.
Was uncomfortable. And I didn't think that, that sort of situation was going to give good environment.
That's a question I ask a lot. Because whenever we think about any of the studies we do, when we're recruiting people to participate, are we getting general population, right? Because these are people that were willing to walk down a hallway with a stranger, right?
Right.
So are they your typical consumer, right? So who are you really measuring? That's interesting. So that's how you felt being first exposed to consumer research. So then what? You did your internship.
Yeah, at that stage, I was really unsure if I wanted to, go to product development or graduate school. And after my internship experience, it really was like, I'd really like to learn more about sensory. I want to go and get my master's. And then begins emailing, graduate school professors and who has opportunities and who has interesting research. And I ended up working with John Hayes at Penn State, doing my master's and PhD. And the one moment that actually, I think, helped me decide to continue on to academia was this opportunity to do a clinical fellowship. So I have an opportunity to do clinical translational research. And for me, that was where I thought I could have a big impact of combining sensory research that has a clinical component.
Yeah. So what does that mean, do you think, to listeners that may not be as aware of like that difference between the clinical research and the more maybe consumer or more, basic research that you might do in academia?
That's a good question. I mean, I think what it was for me was, it's not just learning about what's going to make this person eat more or less of something or reject something. And I think that overall, like designing research studies and working with consumers on obtaining information about sensory, whereas I saw of how does food interact with someone in terms of the overall quality of life. Nutrition is one outcome, but if you lose your sense of taste, how does it impact your quality of life, your dietary needs, such as cancer or cancer treatment, and having this long-term changes in taste perception. So that was really where I thought I could combine our knowledge and our methods in a sensory methodology and work with a clinical population. So I think now more than ever, with so many people have experiencing taste changes or smell changes, we're seeing a big shift in, at least maybe a better understanding of how this can affect quality of life. Whereas before, loss of taste or smell was perceived as just kind of a minor deviation from everyday life, but for someone who actually experiences that is quite devastating.
Right. It can lead to a lot of depression and malnutrition and, all sorts of dangers that we don't really think about.
Right. And just thinking about I like how you mentioned how there's been this new spotlight on it because of COVID, that people are a bit more aware of their senses. And I think there's a greater appreciation for what the senses bring to your just general well-being of life. But I also think that along with that, which kind of goes into the other bit of research that you also do, is that there's been this huge shift in looking into sustainability and looking into ways that you can try to reduce your carbon footprint and, change a little bit of your dietary habits. So can you talk a little bit about how sustainability is also incorporated into some of the work that you do, looking into food consumption and diet habits and things like that?
Yes, yeah, great segue into kind of how do what we eat impact kind of the global environment. And so I really got working in this area once joining my department here at UMass Amherst. The food science department is doing like really cutting edge research in terms of developing the next future plant-based products. I'm coming at it more perspective of what's going to drive consumers' changes in behavior. It's just because you've created this food that maybe mimics another food that we're already consuming doesn't mean that consumers.
And that's a big debate, right? The word mimics. So when it comes to plant-based foods, which, is now the buzzword, and before it used to just be vegetarian or vegan foods, the question is for vegetarians and vegans, do they actually want something that seems as though it's actually made from plants, or does it need to taste exactly like the meat version? And so mimicry versus like just a vegetarian, a straight up vegetarian product. There seems to be a lot of debate over which is the way to go. So in driving behavior, what do you kind of see in that?
That's a really good question. It really depends, as you mentioned, like who the target audience is. And I've been questioning that as well in terms of, the existing vegans and vegetarians, do they want to be eating food that tastes like meat? And I'm sure that it is bipolar of some probably in order to adopt a vegan diet that they would like to still have those qualities. Whereas there are individuals who probably don't want to be eating something like a beef burger. They would prefer like a veggie burger, for example, which are pretty common. But when we're talking about making the biggest impact in terms of sustainability, we can't just focus on the vegans and vegetarians. We need a huge shift across the population to reducing meat.
So it's really about behavior change, though. And this is probably something to pose to both you and Catherine, with her background in behavioral sciences and decision sciences, is what is a real driver, a motivator for people to want to make that switch? I mean, because we have the options. There's a lot of options right now with Impossible Burger, Impossible Foods, et cetera, and Beyond Meat. There's a lot of these options, but is sustainability and the reasoning behind sustainability really a driver for people?
So I would argue that it depends on how seamlessly it fits into the current habits and established habits that somebody already has in their lifestyle. Because if somebody has to go out of their way to make the additional effort, I believe that also plays into why there is an argument for the imitation meat.
Right.
Because if you have a Taco Tuesday every Tuesday, and that's your planned meal for that day of the week, if you have to go making beef tacos every single week to now making something vegetarian, that's going to be a harder sell on the consumer side than if you were to go from having just beef, ground beef, to switching to something like the Impossible Meat. And so I do think that it really depends on how easily the consumer can integrate these innovative technologies.
I guess is my question. Why would they want to? So, it's probably really hard to convince the general population of the US that sustainability is a big enough driver for them, because I think a lot of times cost or maybe even health might be very important drivers to them. Whereas like the Impossible Meats and the Beyond Meats, the imitation ones, are not necessarily healthier, right?
And they're a lot more money.
And they are more expensive, right?
Which is a major barrier to having any type of adoption. But do you have any thoughts on that, Alissa?
I think that this question is so complex, and there's just not enough work that has been done. Is really, I just want to start off by saying that. And I think that there are so many reasons that we consider as barriers to adoption of these products, but also a lack of motivation, as Michelle, you were mentioning, is why. How can we motivate individuals? And sustainability, I don't think is going to be that thing. And I think it's going to be different for different people, right? So like for some people, it's animal welfare. For some others, if it was a cheaper option, maybe. But also, I think, Catherine, your example is really good. Whereas I think, cooking lentils is actually quite easy, but for someone who's never done it before, is like, oh, well, what do I do? How do I actually prepare this for my family? But I think switching from like a beef to turkey could have sustainability benefits, or beef to chicken. But beef to lentils, you can cook lentils. I don't know, maybe not everyone, but even just the saying a plant is that consumers expect it to taste bad.
Yeah.
and are not going to try it.
And
There's
I think
just
that's
so
particularly
many
American
barriers.
consumers though, right? Because it does seem to be very cultural. If you look at other cultures around the world, Asia, for example, it's easier for them to adopt a plant-based diet because there are so many more options that are just within their culture that are plant-based. Like meat isn't the main dish for the most part. And so I think it's really interesting when we look at these transitions just in consumer behavior and the consumer marketplace on how to market to these different cultures, because it's an easy buy, I think, for Asia, right? And then you look at the US and I feel like it's already normalized. Like the difference I see is that it's normalized in Asia to be plant-based. It's not in the US, which is why I kind of appreciate the approaches from like having the Impossible Whopper, right? Because while it was a novelty act in some ways, or even moving it into Cracker Barrel, right, for sausages. Like there's just a lot of novelty to it. And, maybe there's some backlash with the whole woke sort of thing. But I think there is something about normalizing it by pairing it with a brand that's familiar, right?
Yes, I totally agree. And I would even add to what you were saying that even within the US, it just depends on where in the US you are. Because just thinking about someone like the LA surfer girl, like that stereotype is somebody that has oat milk. They don't have any dairy products.
Right. But would that person be more likely to choose a garden burger or a Impossible Burger? And I feel like she's going to choose the garden burger.
I could so see that too. In our theoretical minds.
Yeah. Our make-believe person that we've completely stereotyped.
And I think that's a really good question that we haven't, as a research, asked that question. So I think, a lot of these research papers, if you read about consumer acceptance of plant-based, it just automatically starts out, consumers are demanding more sustainable food. Right. But I cannot find an original original studies citing that consumers
are they demanding
don't even know that their food choices are impacting the environment. So how are we saying that there's a demand for sustainable products, and is imitation meats the best way for it? As you just mentioned there, if you are aware of sustainability impacts, you're probably just going to pick the plant-based option. So where, should we be adopting more like meatless? That's how I described it, as, not the imitation product, but like meatless meals where we're eating lentils.
Yeah, like encouraging
versus
like pallets,
And I think that there's been, one way to say it's too many eggs in one basket in terms of, funding all of this imitation product development. There needs to be also other ways that we're working towards sustainable food options. And I think that is shifting consumer behavior and options that are just meatless, like a garden burger that already exists.
Or lentils, right? And perhaps there's not a lentils lobby.
Yes, so many things with politics. But I also wanted to say, Michelle, you kind of brought up about this kind of what everyone else is doing. So like, you were mentioning in Asia, it's customary, it's part of their culture. And I think, as you mentioned, not in the US, it's not part of the culture, but we have some new research saying that it is, well, there's so many factors, right, driving decision, but a lot of it is whether or not you believe that your family and friends, your community around you is accepting of these products, or, motivation to eat these products. So I think there does need to be some, not just the marketing for specific brands or products, it's more globally, how do we actually shift consumers and their beliefs and the
it's
values
a long game, the normalizing, right?
Yeah.
So it's still novelty now, I think. But where we were at when the Impossible Whopper was introduced, and where we are now with Beyond Meat being right there at your regular grocery store, is a huge change for sure, and having it go into Cracker Barrel. So I think that it is becoming more normalized, and maybe you are seeing more of these types of products at barbecues, but it's not normal yet, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that comes to what we were just talking about, where it's really, how do we establish this as a norm, as opposed to just being something that
it takes time, right? It can't just suddenly become normal.
Right.
And I think
believe,
yeah,
go for it. Yeah.
the issue of cost to me is still, with things being more money, I think will continue to be an issue.
Prices have gone up so much. So I think, with the price of meat going up, now would be a great time to have an affordable version, right?
Yeah. And I think that it does depend on your reference network. Absolutely. Because if you are surrounded by people that are really encouraging switching to a meatless option, then you are more likely to be a part of that. And I do think that in some ways there are trendsetters in this space that are like, they have a large group of people, but then that kind of gets into a bit more of the network dynamics of things, where it's like, how impactful are those trendsetters if they are just so far away from what the average person does? And that could involve,
but if a
trendsetter could be monetarily more, privileged. And
right. So, you think of like the Goop stuff, right? I mean,
exactly.
It just seems so far out of touch. But if you think about your average person who has been raised on meat and potatoes, let's say, and meat is so important and has always thought of them as being like protein healthy, you have to have this as a staple. It can be really jarring probably to consider something like when you hear something labeled as meatless, then I feel like they feel like they're getting something taken from them, right? Like just thinking it from that, viewpoint, that sort of psychological perspective that, again, maybe it's better to go the lentil route where you're not trying to fool them into accepting less, right?
Yeah. I was
disappointment.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking the same thing earlier today, and that while imitation, there does seem to be a rationale, right, for reducing the barriers, we're going to present you with exactly the same thing. However, most of these are disappointments. So would you rather eat something that is going to taste different, but is tasty, versus this other thing that they're trying to just like reformulate and reprocess, and unfortunately might not be as healthy because they are trying to deliver on all the same sensory attributes as a traditional hamburger, for example.
So you've had Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat, I assume.
I've tried a couple of them. We don't actually, one of the things that is an issue is accessibility. So even though
it's not in your grocery store.
So I have a Whole Foods that I could drive 30 minutes to get a variety. But at, my local store, not a lot of options, not a lot of variety. And so one of the other things I'll have to mention when purchasing some of these things is that they're still wrapped in plastic. And that actually is more frustrating to me. I'd rather go to my meat counter, get something wrapped in butcher paper than this plastic tray with plastic wrap on it. Like,
that's a really good point. If the goal is sustainability, and that's the argument for making an Impossible Burger, then they should. I mean, I guess I'm wondering about, then you get into like packaging and consumer psychology with packaging. And is that more like, if you're trying to make it more like the burger, which is also wrapped in plastic, like, do you need those sort of cues and signals to make someone believe it's like a burger?
But for me, where I'm trying to be more sustainable, I'm trying to avoid plastic packaging altogether. So for me, it's conflicting.
Yeah.
It doesn't deliver.
And so can you share a little bit about the type of research? Because I know that you said there hasn't been a lot of research on really fundamental questions about the consumer and their perspective and perception on sustainability. But what are you exploring right now within the plant-based protein space?
Yes, I got a couple different projects going on at the moment. And one of the topics that we actually haven't got to is, and especially being on the coast, we have a lot of issues with sustainable fish.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little bit different in terms of what does it mean to be sustainable. So even just within the fishing industry, there's more fish that are more sustainable and less sustainable, but also how they're caught, and also things going on with like fish farming. So we've had a couple projects going on with just even like the name of fish, just as we have currently, you know, if you think about what can we label plant-based meat or plant-based milk, we can't call it milk, or can we? And the same kind of thing is going on with the fish industry. And if you hear these terms or these names of fish species, such as like hake or haddock, they're kind of perceived as being less superior to something like cod. And this might not be, we definitely see differences in terms of where you are locally. Are you from the coast or not? But also bringing, increasing sales for different types of fish can be really beneficial to the fishing community. So it also, and this could be the same conversation if we're reducing our meat consumption, what does that do to the farming industry? And so those same questions are being asked for, you know, the fishing industry as well. So we've done some studies with actually varying whether or not the names of different fish were presented when they tasted them. So that was quite interesting. So we hope to do some more work with that on terms of what's driving food purchases. And if we tell you that it was, you know, sustainably sourced, would that change your decision making? And we have similar studies going on in terms of plant-based yogurts and plant-based meats. We're also trying to address potentially a blending approach. And so I feel that this could be an area of opportunity. You know, it started the conversations around vegan and vegetarianism, where those products can't contain any meat. But really the goal right now is really just to reduce your meat consumption. And a better approach could be a blended product, which there's a couple studies really coming out about that as well.
Yeah, because I was talking to Paul Breslin recently from Monell, and we were talking about milk and soy milk. And it was Linda Flammer as well from Monell. And the idea that, you know, you get a lot of rejection from if you give milk drinkers soy milk, you know, they're like, oh, I don't like that. But yeah, if you blend it, it really gets a lot, your liking goes up.
I think there could be a lot of advantages there, and has definitely been understudied. And I think for those people who are omnivores and are totally fine with eating meat, it seems to me a huge missed opportunity. And I think I haven't checked the market recently, but my knowledge was that a couple new products were launching. I think maybe a sausage, but there's some other studies coming out of UC Davis where they're mixing mushrooms with beef, and that's having, you know, it's reducing your meat consumption while increasing, you know, mushroom consumption. So I think that there's hopefully some more work that could help with the greater adoption, and just hopefully generally reducing consumption of animal-based products.
And I'm a little curious, this is also going to be exposing my naiveness to this world, but in terms of, because I've always been told, you know, you want to get wild salmon if you were compared to like farmed salmon. Like that was generally what I was raised with, the idea of, because I was told it was less, like calorically, it was going to be less because they weren't being fed corn compared to, you know, just having it be whatever happened in the ocean.
But if you're thinking about sustainable and all these things.
But then you think of the full picture of it, where it's like, for somebody to go deep sea fishing, there has to be fuel and a whole boat and everything to actually go out there. And so it makes me wonder, like, what is the general sentiment right now about having something be farm raised compared to wild?
I really think it's going to depend on who you talk to. So I've been working very closely. We have a marine station out in Gloucester. So those individuals are very focused on boosting the local economy. And that does involve, you know, I don't even know all the right terms, but, you know, traditional fishing. But there are ways that fishermen have become more sustainable. So there are restrictions on the size of the boat or the amount of fuel, right? Because I had those same thoughts of like, well, to me, farmed fish, that seems more sustainable, right? But it does have impacts on the economy, and they are trying to be more sustainable in their fishing techniques. So I think it really depends on who you speak to, but I think these are really important questions, and also about the nutrition or are you concerned with the quality of life of a fish?
Right.
If you think about all the things that we talk about farmed raised, chickens, right? It's like, they're squished in together, they're treated with I don't know. I'm not a farmer, so I shouldn't say, but that's the perceptions of consumers.
It is the perception,
right? So like you can think about, you see these images pop in your head of like a farmed fish looks like distorted versus like a fish that can, like, free range fish, right? Like, so I don't know, all of these things are important, but also the nutritional aspect of, maybe mercury in the fish in the waters where that can be controlled in an environment. And I was recently reading about the plastic pollution, right? So the microplastics, it's going to be everywhere. Does that mean farmed fish is safer to eat than, in the ocean now because of all the plastic pollution? These are just like tons of questions. I don't have
it's a rabbit hole of issues.
It really is a rabbit hole
in terms of sustainability. But I really like to know, someone can tell me, please. No. What I really like to know is, if I'm an omnivore and I eat meat, I don't know, what's the average person meat consumption? And I want to be sustainable, or even like globally, what does the average consumer need to reduce their meat consumption by? And I don't have the answer. So when we're talking about, I don't need to be vegan to have an impact, right? Like, what?
But if you reduce down to once a week or twice a week, is that enough?
Will that make an impact? I know that was one of the questions we have, is like, what's our measure of success? And I know that some people are like, oh, well, plant-based sales are through the roof. And it's like, oh, that's great. But when you actually look at retail sales, so for like retail sales of beef, right? Total beef, if you were to put like burgers, plant-based burgers take up 2% of total retail sales of burgers. So like, to me, that doesn't seem successpable, but I would like to know, is that making an impact in terms of,
is it actually
sustainability is what I'd like to know. And to me, that seems very, very small. Obviously, where it's growing, we want to continue that. But in terms of how much money's been put into these imitation products, are we getting the benefit based on but as we've mentioned earlier, it's a long-term game here that we're playing, and we don't expect to see, impact right away. But what I'd like to know is, how, in terms of the total US population, in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, what does the level of beef need to be at? How many farms, what's the economy going to be like if we needed to really get to that point? What's that level of impact? And I don't hear those conversations happening, but I'm just not in that space. But I feel like from a consumer's perspective, in terms of motivation, I think that information would be useful. And we hear
it helps to know that, if I choose these 3 days, that's going to be something.
Yeah. And I wonder if it's almost like the reframing of that as well, where it's, as opposed to, and again, it kind of goes back to what we were saying before, as opposed to stripping somebody and saying, I'm going to go meatless those days, maybe saying, today I'm going to try to incorporate more plant-based meals into my plans.
This happens exactly with my husband, because I do the most of the cooking and I love cooking. And whenever I say to him like, oh, there's no meat in this, and he was like, why did you tell me that? I was enjoying this. Now I feel like I'm missing something. Meatless Sundays,
Yeah. I feel like this conversation really opened me up to realizing how many questions there are within this space that need some true exploration, because everyone knows that sustainability is I feel like it's almost like this trendy word. It's like up and coming and trendy and everything, but there are fundamental things that have to be figured out before we can really make major milestone steps. And to that point, it's like, what are the milestones? Like where do we build our success criteria? So those are all really important questions to be asking. I am going to pivot the conversation because unfortunately we're already really close to being up with our time. But we could talk to you about this probably for hours and hours.
It's really fascinating.
It really is. But
important.
I want to get a bit of an understanding of your perceptions. We've been talking a lot about consumer perceptions with the React Attack game. Basically, the way it's going to work is I have 10 words listed out here or phrases. And I just want you to say the first word that comes to your mind after I share them with you.
Free association.
I'm ready.
Awesome. All right. So first word, central location testing. I should say the first phrase.
Mall.
Food.
Fun.
Snacks.
Convenience.
Imitation meat.
I guess Impossible Burger.
Impossible Burger. Penn State.
We are.
Sensory science.
Taste.
Diets.
Fads.
Habits.
I don't know. Conventional.
It doesn't have to fit it. It can be like cheese.
Yes.
Okay. And for your last word of this episode, cookies and cream.
Ice cream.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking too. That's my favorite ice cream. I'm clearly a sweet tooth and fine with sugary gum and things like that. But thank you so much for joining us.
I need someone to make that mashed potato gum.
Yeah. Where can everyone find you if they want to learn more about your research, but also a bit more about this topic in general?
Yeah, so I have Twitter at Sensory Food Sci, and if you prefer Instagram or Facebook, it's Nolden Sensory Team.
Awesome.
We post our research and everything on there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. It's been very informative on our end, at least on my end, I should say. But thank you so much. And until next time, we'll talk soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you, and stay tuned for more curious conversations.